Okay, hi everyone. So you should see the poll here on your screen. Before we get started, we'll get to know each other a little bit better. So please go ahead and select the region that you're located in, and we'll get started. In the meantime, while participants are selecting their region, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today, for tuning into our webinar on financing an end to the water and sanitation crisis. So I'll leave this on just a couple of seconds longer for a full minute for people to vote. Okay, most people have voted, so I can go ahead and share those results. So if you can take a look at your screen, here's kind of the spread of our registrants or our attendees today. And I think for those calling in using their phone, I think they're not able to participate in the poll. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I will briefly go through the agenda of our session today, which is scheduled to run for a full hour, but might go a little bit over that depending on the question and answer period at the end of the presentation. So I'll start off by giving an introduction of our speakers. We have a fantastic panel of 6 amazing speakers joining us today. Our first speaker will be Catarina Fonseca, and she will kick us off by showing us some great visuals to help us think about the topic of finance. Next, Heloise Chicou will tell us about the high-level meetings happening next month in Washington, D.C. And following that, Lotte Feuerstein will address some of the corruption risks involved in financing mechanisms in water, sanitation, and hygiene. And Lemme will then discuss the importance of thinking about the cost of the full life cycle of a WASH project. And following Kim, Kate will teach us about the unique contribution of market-based approaches to thinking about financing. And last but not least, Susan Davis will wrap up the presentations by looking at the need for funding to be focused on elements of WASH initiatives that are beyond physical infrastructure. So during the course of the presentations today, I invite you all to ask our speakers questions using the question chat feature, and we'll do our best to address these questions at the end of the session, at which point you'll also be able to use the raise your hand feature to ask a question. Okay. So before we get started, I'd like to introduce myself a bit more formally. My name is Alix Charles. I'm a campaign consultant for End Water Poverty. As such, I've been helping the End Water Poverty team coordinate the Water Action Month campaign that we've been running through March, supporting dozens of organizations around the world, utilizing the month of March to make very important, meaningful strides towards achieving an end to the water and sanitation crisis for all. So it's my honor to introduce you to our 6 amazing panelists today. Catarina Fonseca is the head of International and Innovation Programs at IRC. Heloise Chicou is the Civil Society Advisor at Sanitation and Water for All. Lotte Feuerstein is a Program Manager at the Water Integrity Network. Lemme is the Senior Global Advisor for Sustainability at Water for People. Kate Fogelberg is the Senior Consultant at the Springfield Center for Business and Development. And last but certainly not least, Susan Davis is the Founder and Executive Director at Improve International. So it's a privilege to be among you all today. And without further ado, I will pass the mic and mouse control over to Catarina to kick us off. So just bear with me 1 second. So Catarina, I'll send you an unmute request. So you can go ahead and unmute yourself, and I will pass you on over the mouse control. So you have the floor, Catarina.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invite to participate in this interesting webinar. I also have to say it's the first time ever that I'm on an all-women panel on finance for water, so I think it's a milestone. I'll be talking exactly for 7 minutes about the largest problems at the moment concerning finance for water. And I will focus on the big picture. And talking about the big picture, let's see if the mouse control works. It does. Wait, too fast. Okay, got it. So talking about the big picture, I actually took the idea of this picture from a presentation last week at the World Bank, but I don't know who was the author, so I cannot credit the author, but I changed the wording. So the water sector, the water and sanitation sector is still seen very much as an infrastructure sector. This means that the importance of anything which is not capital expenditure has been systematically unappreciated. We have at the top capital expenditure, minor maintenance usually is expected that users and consumers pay for it through tariffs, but there is an overall fixation on investments in the construction of the infrastructure with insufficient attention to the rest of the systems that are needed to actually make that infrastructure work. So for instance, the regulation, the policy, the monitoring, the institutions, and ultimately actually the people that do all of this work at national, regional, and district level. I skipped major maintenance. I meant to say that actually major maintenance and rehabilitation programs have now had more attention from large finance programs, but they're still very much also underappreciated. In the financing discussions for the water sector, this is what we call at IRC an overall systems blindness. So this has led, despite successes in increased first-time coverage, to a crisis of sustainability and poor services that most of you probably know about. The ambitious targets of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, together with the growing sustainability crisis, which we can see in the high rates of non-functional infrastructure or infrastructure providing a very poor level of service, means that the current sector investments, particularly in the poorest countries, are chronically short and poorly targeted. The Joint Monitoring Program report that came out last Friday, which has all the latest sector data, shows that more than 1/3 of countries are not on track to achieve universal access to improved water sources by 2030. I'm not showing or talking about sanitation because I do not have time, but the data and the seriousness of the problem is even higher. So there are billions of dollars sunk into infrastructure and assets which become non-functional after a few years because of a failure to set up maintenance systems within the districts to keep water running. So funds at district level usually cover salaries. Tariff setting is inadequate to cover minor maintenance. There's also no public funds available for major maintenance. And this means that there are millions of dollars being wasted because of a failure to pay for a $20 a leak repair or fuel for motorized pumps. The worst is, and this also, that's what the picture shows, this also shows very frustrated service providers, districts, authorities, regional authorities, which do have a very high ambition and would like to provide increased level of services, but are also stuck within these financial straps. So the worst is that the result of this is that the investment that there is, it tends to favor the better off. With very few exceptions, there have been no reductions in inequalities of access to water and sanitation since the 1990s. Also from the JNP reports from last week, almost half of the people drinking water from unprotected sources live in sub-Saharan Africa. 8 in 10 live in rural areas, and there are large gaps between the richest and the poorest, but also in urban areas. Recent financial budget tracking studies in Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, India, Burkina Faso, just to mention a few that I had access to, they also show that there is no correlation between the investments in water supply and sanitation in the country, within the country, and the areas which have the lowest coverage. So to make progress, a radically new financing approach is needed in the sector. And this means, what does this mean? How how have we in the US, in Europe, among other countries, how did we reach universal access to water and sanitation? And there's two things which are common. So the first is that the state does need to take ownership for the sector overall and understand that the critical part of this role is to provide leadership and use its resources, which is called public finance, to create national systems necessary to allow and attract the much needed private investment for both new capital and the private provision of services. A key part of this national enabling environment is that we have strong service authorities that actually regulate and monitor the sector adequately. The second one is that the state understands that it will always have to act as the final guarantor of the risk of this private investment, but also understands that it will always have to develop and support subsidy systems to get services to the poorest. The poorest, nowhere in the world have reached access, have been the last ones to have access to water and sanitation without some sort of subsidization. My last slide. Hope it works. I'm trying to move to the next slide. Clicking, thank you for the help. So, but there are some real challenges. The latest GLASS report, over this week, there's all of these greatest reports on water and sanitation, the latest data. So this week we have the JMP and the Sanitation and Water for All report, and the GLASS report will come out in April. I have to say I have access to it, and when this challenge comes over and over again. So when asked specifically about the availability of WASH expenditure reports, many countries, not most, but many countries, and most of those which are off track to reach the SDGs, still indicate difficulties in gathering financial information on WASH across ministries and how much has been actually spent. So we still don't know this information for many of the countries. To end, I would actually go further in mentioning that governments and donors, and I'm glad that there will be some panelists talking about this, need to be more accountable for understanding all the real costs of services and how long the investments are actually lasting. And Kim will introduce some of the tools to do this in her presentation. But also understanding where the funding is going to ensure a real commitment to increase public finance for those that most need it. That's it for all. Thank you, and I look forward for your comments and questions later on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Catarina, for those great visuals to really set the scene and get us started. So I will hand over the mic and mouse controls over now to Heloise Chicou, who is the Civil Society Advisor for Sanitation and Water for All. Heloise will tell us, apologies for that, I'm not quite sure what happened there. Heloise will tell us more about the high-level meetings coming up in Washington, D.C. And the Sanitation and Water for All.
Hello, everybody. So this is Heloise, SW CSO Advisor. So I'll be talking for 6 minutes about sanitation and water for all and how it can be an opportunity to engage for CSOs around finance. Just a reminder for those that are not...
Alex, can you hear us?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, good.
Sorry, we're just sorting out the slides. Alex, can you move to the next slide?
Sure.
So just a reminder for those that are not familiar with Water and Sanitation for All, it's an international platform which gathers different actors, counting countries, civil society, external support agencies, research and learning, and the private sector. And the idea of the platform is to bring those actors to have leadership and put political leadership around access to water and sanitation, discuss on strategies on how to deliver those services, and share expertise and a common vision. So SWA has made as a priority the implementation of the SDGs, and it wishes to do so by gathering all these actors to act together and look at strategies together. So it comes from the idea that today we're faced with a major challenge, which is that obviously the SDGs are much more ambitious. They look at universal access, they look at efficiency, they look at sanitation even more as a priority by looking at wastewater, and they look at safe access to sanitation and water. This has repercussions and impacts on the way we look at finance. According to one of the latest reports of the World Bank, the total capital investment to deliver universal access to safely managed water and sanitation is around $114 billion per year. So we're talking about a real major shift in terms of investment with a huge effort required. So in general, the sector needs to develop stronger approaches. One approach is to look at improving the efficiency of the sector and the way we disperse finance, and the other way is looking at additional finance. And SWA actors and members have worked together to push for an approach that is not a project approach, but is actually an approach where governments and donors and all the actors are trying to improve the system and push for financing the system. What does it mean to finance the system is to look at the collaborative behaviors. So the key behaviors that will improve system and national processes performance. So where do the high-level meetings come and how do they add to this general discussion on finance? So this year in April, we will have the high-level political meetings that will happen in Washington during the spring meetings of the World Bank. The first meeting will be on the 19th of April and will be the sector ministers meeting, in which sector ministers from water and sanitation will gather together to look at different subjects. Sorry, next slide. The subject that they will look on is they will try together to make a synthesis of where they're at in terms of SDGs. Then they will look at the bottlenecks and the difficulties they have in terms of delivering the SDGs. And the third thing that they will do together during this 1 day and a half meeting is to look at the type of activities and plans that they can make and take in order to deliver the implementation of the SDGs and the collaborative behaviors. And this will be done through ministerial dialogues. So this is a first step where you have sector ministers meet.
Heloise, I'm not sure if you're still there. I think we might have lost your audio. Can you hear me?
What are the type of activities that they should fund to implement the SDG? And this is where you will see in this meeting that 3 subjects that I have presented are portrayed, which is that the finance ministers meeting, will talk about how to estimate the magnitude of the SDG challenge, how to use existing resources more efficiently and effectively, and how to access new resources for the sector. Alix, if you can move to the next slide, we're having problems with slides. Exactly, so you see here the 3 subjects that the finance ministers meeting will talk about and where governments will have a discussion. Like I was saying, estimating the magnitude of the challenge, using existing resources more effectively, and accessing new resources for the sector. Next slide. So finally, what does it mean for CSOs and how can CSOs engage in this process? So CSOs are key to SWA because, like I said, they're a constituency and they can use SWA as a way to share their messages around finance. They can do that at the international level and they can do that at the national level by engaging directly with their governments. what they can push for is strong messages on social inclusivity, for example, non-discriminative and transparent measures. They can push for the respect of the human rights, especially on affordability for finance. But CSO can also be watchdogs. They can ask their governments to be accountable by making national and local budgets provisions to be available to the public. CSOs can also monitor budgets and track budgets to make sure they provide for the poorest. And they can monitor the government's commitments at the SWA meeting, or at least the government's plans for implementing the SDGs by asking governments to be accountable when they come back home at the national level on what they have been saying at the international level. And finally, CSOs can participate in budget definition and orientations through requesting for participatory approaches. And this is where SWA is interesting, as SWA has always made participatory approaches at the international and national level a priority of its advocacy. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Heloise. I think those action items are great for civil society organizations and their members in the audience to really have in their toolkit going forward and leading up to the high-level meetings next month. So we'll give the floor next to Lotte, and I will hand over the mouse controls over to you, Lotte. So Lotte, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, so I will be looking at the corruption risks in the budget process and what CSOs can do to address them. So this is basically one of the bottlenecks in ensuring that existing finances are used more efficiently. Yes, okay. So this is, I'll focus on public finance because that's so crucial in terms of financing the end to the water and sanitation crisis. So here you see the budget cycle, which is basically, it starts with formulation, which usually has two steps, which is first a strategic planning and then a detailed budget planning. So this is something that mainly happens in the sector ministries, and they usually get ceilings from the finance ministry in terms of how much they could budget for. And here the biggest risk is that bias to large investments, and corruption can be one important driver in terms of prioritizing large investments over either small decentralized investments or also over budgeting for maintenance costs, simply because there's usually more opportunity to get money into your pockets through corruption in these large investments. Then there's the approval process, which is usually through the parliament. And here again, there is a risk of political capture. Parliamentarians sort of, putting specific projects that serve their interest groups into the budget or otherwise blocking the budget. And then we go into, once the budget is approved, that it goes into execution, and this is where, of course, the biggest chunk is, and where you have the whole issues about corruption in procurement, but also other types of fraudulent expenditure. I'll just give an example of that in the next slide. And where, of course, you also have the issues of diversion of funds into other sectors. So in that phase, water usually competes with other sectors, and that's also where the absorption, the low absorption capacity of water ministries is so, so damaging for the sector. And then in the end, you have the evaluation. This is something that should be happening at the parliamentarian level, and where, again, the audit reports play an important role. And there, well, a big bottleneck is that usually, even if corrupt activities are detected through audit reports, there's little or no follow-up. And you also often have political interference with the audit bodies. Alix, could you help me? Okay. So the next slide is a case in Benin, which was a 70 million water program funded by the Netherlands and the EU. And the funds were channeled through the Benin Ministry of Water. And in 2015, there was an audit which actually unveiled misuse of around 4 million euros by the ministry. The main, how that misuse was done was mainly through fake contracts or contracts for fake projects with companies that actually don't really exist, but that are shell companies owned by high-level officials, and also fraudulent accounting. One big problem is that there are very little details available about this case because the forensic audit report still hasn't been published. And this is something where civil society, for example, in Benin is pushing for this, but so far without success. Now let's see what can be done about it. Alix, could you go to the next slide? Thanks a lot. So this is what we call building integrity walls, which are mainly based on the 4 pillars of transparency, accountability, participation, and anti-corruption. And here are just a few examples of what CSOs can do in this. So during in terms of transparency, a key thing is to advocate for publishing detailed budgets at all levels of government, and to also publish the detailed plans and contracting documents. And this is something where it's important for CSOs to, for example, link up with parliaments where actually the parliamentarian committees can have big influence on this. And then once you have more information available, of course, you can use that for accountability. So once you have these detailed budgets, for example, to track and monitor budgets, as well as procurement processes and the implementation of these, becomes much more easy for civil society. In terms of accountability, again, audits are also extremely important, and this is both civil society reaching out to national auditing institutions, but also engaging directly itself in social audits. And then, of course, participation is another key pillar. Heloise has already mentioned it. And here, especially at local level, civil society can play an important role in participating in public participation fora, in planning and review processes, and making sure that the voices of the most marginalized are heard in these fora. Now again, it will also need some sort of more hard anti-corruption measures. A big part of that is actually speaking out against corruption, linking up, for example, with anti-corruption commissions, using whistleblowing systems, but also linking up to critical journalists and investigative journalists who can actually also make corruption cases known. And lastly, another example for that, which is a case from Mozambique of successful parliamentary lobbying. And one important aspect of that has been that they have a coalition of different basic services sectors, which makes it much more easy for the parliamentarian committees that are in charge of budgets to actually link up with civil society, because they don't have to talk to 3 different people for health, education, water, but they are all linked up already. And they provide quite technical position papers, and hand these to the committees that are in charge of planning and budgeting, and also in charge of budget review. And through that, they have been able to, on the one hand side, lobby for additional funding, and also in times of austerity to shield civil basic services sectors from budget cuts. But actually, the Ministry of Finance also realized that they were getting a lot of very critical questions from the parliamentarian committees, and therefore decided to institutionalize themselves a consultation with the civil society group to prepare before things go into Parliament. Yeah, and that's it from my side. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Lotte, for those concrete examples and for adding yet another set of tools for civil society organizations and concerned citizens in the audience to get involved. Kim, I will give you the floor next, and Kim will teach us about the full life cycle costing of WASH projects. So Kim, I'll go ahead and unmute you and pass you over the mouse control. If you prefer that I control the slides for you, I'm happy to do so. There's a slight delay of maybe a second or two from when you click with your mouse to when the slide actually changes, just to let you know.
Great, thanks. I'll give it a shot from here, and we'll see. I'll let you know if I need your help.
Sounds great.
I think first, thanks to End Water Poverty for putting this together, because looking at the different panelists and having worked with them to put the slides together, this is really a very holistic look at a problem that continues to come up and continues to be a challenge in the sector. I was at a conference in December, and the moderator of the panel that I was on was talking about how the WASH sector needs to become much more financially literate. And really, in my opinion, one of the biggest things to do that is to really just sit down and crunch the numbers. And so to pick up on what some of the other panelists have said, we will look at, if we can go to the next slide, we can look at the life cycle costing of what it takes to deliver services to rural, urban, any settings that need it. And this is a different way of looking at Catarina's slide that looked at it with an iceberg. And I think one of the huge emphasis tends to continue to be on the initial infrastructure, really, where the emphasis is to get access to all people. So that's the big corner chunk of the pie that you have on your screen right there. And while that's critically important, one of the things that we are trying to focus on at Water for People is all of these other pieces that help services continue over time. So while one of the biggest investments needs to be the cost to actually increase infrastructure, many of the other critical pieces, although they're smaller pieces, those are the pieces that keep the water flowing over time and help to sustain those initial infrastructure investment costs. So that's what I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about, and I look forward to questions that come up at the end of the panel. So if you move to the left clockwise from the initial infrastructure investment costs, you look at operation and minor maintenance costs. And really understanding what that looks like over time, what needs to be replaced, what small minor repairs need to be done every 6 months, every year, to keep those small pieces working, to keep the entire system working. The replacement costs are obviously something to keep an eye on. Those are not as recurring as the minor maintenance costs and the operational costs, but the replacement costs are something that need to be planned for and budgeted for, and having an understanding of what those costs are and how much they will be and a ballpark of when they might happen is really critical to keeping those initial infrastructure investments going over the long haul. As you continue moving up to the left, the direct support costs are also a critical piece that are really most often the investment made by the service authority, most often the local government. So a WASH office in a municipality in Latin America needs to have an understanding of what does their budget need to be to provide the technical assistance and to provide monitoring of water service delivery, and what supervision needs to be happening and oversight and testing of water quality and those things. So these are some really critical pieces that, although they're not huge in dollar amounts, if they're not done properly, they can really break down the system, the service delivery throughout water systems. As you continue on, indirect support costs is at a higher level, more the advocacy and things that happen kind of at the national level to make sure that everything filters down to municipal and districts most appropriately, and you're not running into big corruption problems and things like that. And the cost of capital, if financing needs to happen in order for investments to be maintained, you have to factor in the cost of capital. So there's a lot of different pieces here that look at the entire life cycle of what it costs to deliver services, and I like to emphasize the overtime piece. It's not just a one-time investment, but how do you keep those investments as healthy as possible? We can go to the next slide. Great, so Water for People, and along with some of our partners and Catarina and her team certainly are some of those people we've worked very closely with on these financial tools. And really what the financial tools are, they don't give you all the answers, but they give you the numbers that you need to make informed and evidence-based decisions. So first and foremost, I've said this, planning and budgeting is really critical and is key for services to be delivered and sustained over time. It's not something right now that is done regularly or is done very well in many countries around the world. It's something that we're working on in the districts and municipalities where we focus to really get that understanding. It's a simple exercise, but if it's not prioritized, it can often create challenges to systems being delivered over time. Or services being delivered over time. So a couple of the tools, we've got a toolkit going on, but I will highlight a couple of those that are most related to the financial sustainability of service delivery. First of that is the asset analysis tool, and what that does is helps municipalities and districts to plan and budget what you need, and that starts with what you have. So you need to know the status and the functionality and the service level being provided by all of the infrastructure in your district. And so that gives you a picture of where you are today, and it also helps to project and forecast a little bit where you might be in 5, 10, 15 years. So you can plan and budget accordingly. The second tool that is most related to this conversation is the direct support costing tool. And that's really a tool for the district to understand what is it, where are they budgeting now in terms of their direct support to water service delivery, and where should they be. So it's a look at the kind of a current reality check versus an ideal world, and helps you to create an understanding of how do you move, how do you shrink that gap. And finally, we need to make sure that we have the right amount of revenue, and the Lifecycle cash flow tool, which we call At What Cost at Water for People, is a way to calculate the revenue that would go along with the costs that you've calculated. So how much of the operation and maintenance costs can be covered by user fees is one way. This is a tool that helps you take a look at that, and do you need to increase tariffs? Do you need to increase taxes? It helps you play around with different scenarios and understand what your revenue might look like based on different assumptions. If we can go to the next slide. And I think in addition to the planning and budgeting emphasis that I just covered is the roles and responsibilities. If district WASH offices don't know what their roles are and their responsibilities are, they're not going to be able to do them very well. And so as you're having these conversations and as you're thinking about what the costs are, it's really also important to understand who's responsible for those costs in the long run. We break down some of the different players in these games into a couple of different buckets, one of them being the service authority. This is the regulator providing oversight. Most often it's the local wash office or a district that has the responsibility of providing water service delivery to its constituents. Moving on to the service provider, that's the day-to-day provider of a water system. It looks kind of like a utility, right? They make the minor repairs, they collect the fees from the people collecting water, and in many places, this is still a volunteer water committee that works in a rural area that plays this role of keeping the water flowing with support from the service authority. And so those two players really need to understand what's the role and what's the responsibility and what costs will be covered by the service authority. And likewise, the service provider also needs to know what they're responsible for. I think some of the tools I talked about on the last slide really help clarify what those numbers are and then help hold accountable the different players for what their roles are. Two examples that I can touch on lightly before I'm out of time is in our work in Rwanda, in one district, there's what you can call a public-private partnership between the district and there's a private operator. The district said, listen, we're not best equipped to provide water services over time, but it is our mandate. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a district water board that will carry out the service authority function and look at it from the regulator governmental perspective, but we're going to bid out the management, the day-to-day management of water systems to a private operator. And so again, that's a really good example of where roles and responsibilities need to be clearly defined in the contract. And along with the roles and responsibilities, the financial aspect to that too. So using the calculations from the tools and understanding who's going to do what and who's going to be responsible when, because then when challenges arise, as they always do, you're not sitting around with people pointing fingers at one another. People can say, yep, that's our responsibility, we need to do a better job. And finally, in another context in Latin America, our work in Honduras, water committees are the service provider, the day-to-day service provider, and they collect tariffs from community members and they make sure that repairs are made in a timely manner. And so in addition to the day-to-day, they have created Association of Water Committees. So that's, rather than having to jump to the national level or to the municipal level and be dependent on an under-resourced municipality, the Association of Water Committees has basically created a level of support that has proven really valuable, both from a financial and a technical support perspective, to provide support to those service providers, being the water committees. And so, again, if you walk away from my slides, the two things I would say, planning and budgeting, are critical and key. And they're not that hard, but people often shy away from those exercises. And finally, roles and responsibilities and who is doing what and who is paying for what. Thanks, Alix. I'll hand it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim, for those case studies and those two kind of action items at the end there. I think those are great to keep in mind moving forward. So next, I will hand it over to Kate, and Kate will tell us about market approaches and how they contribute to filling the SDG WASH financing gap. So Kate, I will unmute you, or I will send an unmute request. It looks like you'll have to unmute your microphone on your end. Great. Okay. And I will go ahead and give you the mouse control, although I'm happy to change the slides for you if you'd like. So you have the floor.
Great. Thanks, Alix, for the invitation and for the floor. I'm going to just jump right in since we're a little bit behind. My name is Kate Fogelberg, and I work at a British consulting, training, and advisory organization that specializes in market systems development. I prepared my 7 minutes today thinking about some of the topics that Heloise mentioned in the SWA Finance webinar, namely that in order to reach the SDGs, we as a sector need to become more efficient with the existing finance that we have. We also need to access new resources, in particular domestic commercial finance, and thus how can NGOs use their limited funding to address these 2 points as part of their contribution towards the more expensive SDGs? And I might need you to advance the slides as it doesn't seem to be working. Thanks, Alix. So very quickly, when we think of markets, we often think of supply and demand transactions. In the case of WASH, this could be an individual demanding a water service, toilet construction, or a pit emptying service. And on the supply side, it could be water committees, public or private utilities, builders, and emptiers providing goods and services. And yet, we all know intuitively that the root causes of how well that core transaction happens. So does a water committee provide water reliably? Are there builders available to build toilets? Are often found in what I call supporting functions. So finance, technology options, management models, information, and rules, which is on the bottom, from social norms to formal regulations. And often the success or failure at the transaction level is shaped by the capacities and incentives of the players involved in the entire market system, not just the supply and demand transaction. Next slide, please. Oh, and this one has a little animation. So can you hit the next slide again, please, Alix? So what's different in a market systems approach? In the case of WASH, the absence of infrastructure or a water committee led, and still leads, many down the path on the left side, concluding that construction or some training will solve the problem. But we all know it's not that simple. The absence of infrastructure is a symptom of many other political, financial, and social causes. One click, please, Alix. So in a systems development approach, you'd ask different questions or deeper questions, get different answers, and intervene differently. I know this sounds a bit fuzzy, but the real-life example I'll share in a moment will hopefully illustrate the difference a bit better. But while we're on this slide, I think a clear example of these different approaches is in the NGO water.org, who has been a leader in supporting microfinance institutions to lend for water and sanitation. Many do that now, but they were one of the first. And instead of continuing down the left side path, I would say, and continuing to directly finance infrastructure, they realized that the growing microfinance industry could have an incentive to develop WASH lending products. And they reframed the WASH finance crisis as an opportunity for the microfinance sector and shifted their philanthropic funding from building stuff to building capacity of MFIs to secure commercial finance. Next slide, please. But on to today's example. How can NGOs contribute to increasing efficiency and attract new sources of funding by using a market systems approach? We're going to use the example of non-revenue water, which simply is the water that's produced but lost before it reaches consumers. The glass half empty perspective would bemoan the troubling global estimates that suggest that half of the water produced is lost, a literal global half empty. NRW is a massive inefficiency. It reduces revenues, causes intermittent supply, and often leads to unnecessary water source expansion, causing both physical and commercial losses. Nobody wants to fund NRW, as politicians and donors alike prefer shiny new things as opposed to operational efficiency measures, and commercial financing options are limited, as many utilities or water committees are not considered creditworthy. It disproportionately affects the poor, who either aren't connected because there isn't enough water available, or are connected and are the first to be cut off during rationing. However, the glass half full would counter with the fact that by having the current rates of NRW, annually up to 3 billion could be freed up and services extended to 90 million people, contributing to both the finance and access gap. It's not limited to large utilities. Many rural and peri-urban communities rely, or don't, on small pipe systems. Next slide, please. So how is one group addressing non-revenue water using a market systems approach to improve efficiency and attract new financing? Very quickly, the backstory. Kenya Markets Trust and SNB have been supporting a water operator professionalization process for the last several years in Kenya. It involves a range of activities beyond the one I'm going to talk about. But one of the things they did was identify non-revenue water and access to finance, some of the key constraints towards improving efficiency, service levels, and access in pipe systems in rural Kenya. This is not that new. Many have done this. What is different is how they responded. They didn't respond with the answer of, let's use our limited philanthropic funding to finance or co-finance meters, which is often a standard response. Instead, they responded by saying, well, why don't other financing mechanisms exist in this context for service providers? And spent their money developing a lease market. Very quickly on leasing, we won't get into the details of it, but why it's relevant and important for service providers is that it focuses on their ability to generate cash flow from the business opportunity, in this case meters, rather than their balance sheet or past credit history, which are usually severe limitations for small water or sanitation service providers. They can be fully financed, unlike a loan, don't require collateral as equipment, can be removed upon non-payment, and can increase bankability and lead to future loans for greater investment. So what was actually different in practice? Instead of financing and procuring the equipment themselves and conducting training on how to use them, they did the following. First, they researched the leasing market in general in Kenya to see if it was applicable to the water sector. Part of that included stakeholder analysis to determine the appetite for a leasing financing model with regulator, service authorities, service providers, financial institutions, equipment providers, and consumers. They then provided technical assistance to structure a lease agreement between service providers, the first moving financial institution, and equipment provider. Cost shared a partial guarantee, and are documenting and sharing the resulting service metrics. Early results are quite positive. Average NRW has dropped from over 60% to close to 40%, with improved measurement and billing. They've expanded access by close to 70% and leveraged previously unavailable commercial financing for rural water supply improvements. What I find clever about this is that it's using philanthropic funds to support a new domestic financing mechanism that, one, improves service provider efficiency by addressing non-revenue water, two, attracts new domestic commercial financing to the sector, and three, increases the bankability of service providers, all three challenges identified in financing the SDGs globally. This example touched on meters. There's interest and possibility to expand it to other types of technologies, which again allows public and ODA to focus on other underinvested areas. Next slide, please. So what, you might say, right? The first point gets at a bit what Catarina was talking about. And instead of being systems blind, I would say put your systems goggles on. There's increasingly more literature and discussion talking about how the WASH sector can take a complex idea of systems analysis and put it into practice. And the second point I would just say is keep these massive SDG financial challenges at the forefront of your work and your interventions. How is what you are doing going to contribute to help service providers or the sector in general be more efficient or attract more domestic commercial funding? Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. I think that the market approaches is often a bit beyond people's comfort zones when it comes to thinking about the complexities of WASH and water infrastructure. So really appreciate you, putting it in types of terms that most people can understand. And I think that your note on diagnosing and addressing the root causes and not just symptoms is especially important. So last but not least, let's hear now from Susan Davis, who will look at some numbers and figures from a recent report and tell us how WASH donors can influence sustainability So Susan, I see that you're unmuted, and I'll give you the mouse controls, but I'm happy to change the slides for you. So go ahead, you have the floor.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and I will try to compress my 6 minutes into 30 seconds. I'm Susan Davis with Improve International. We are a not-for-profit research and consulting organization focused on improving sustainability of water and sanitation services. It's always hard to go last after a bunch of amazing experts, so I hope I'm not too repetitive, but a lot of what we'll say will reflect what you've heard already. One of the angles we're particularly interested in at Improve is how funding mechanisms affect program design and thus the sustainability of outcomes. How does the way money is given affect the intervention and thus how it works? So I'm going to share some highlights of results from a survey that we did in fall of 2006. Ideally, we'd be looking at evidence of what works over time, but that's scarce. So we asked a bunch of people who actually do work in the field what they think. We got 112 qualified responses from different kinds of WASH NGOs, and they covered donors from 43 countries, primarily United States, including foundations, developed country aid agencies, the UN, and World Bank. Next slide, please. And one of the big questions we asked, these are just highlights. The full report is available on our website, which is improveinternational.org. But one of the big questions was, do you think, as an NGO, that the ways that donors fund can influence the sustainability of WASH services? I think what we've heard in the earlier presentations and what people respond in the survey is a resounding yes, it does matter. And we asked several other questions related to underfunded activities, and some of the ones that probably will sound familiar to you is about 60% of the people said monitoring or evaluation after the program is underfunded, research is underfunded, professional development of organizational staff is underfunded, knowledge management and learning, professional development of local government or partner organizations, and resolution of problems identified after the project all are underfunded, and about 50% of the respondents said that for all of those. So next slide, please. And this because I think you're required to put a pie chart in all presentations. Mine will look quite familiar, but as you've heard before, a lot of donors, especially philanthropic donors, like to see or fund, as someone said, the new and shiny things, new stuff, because they can see it's tangible. They can see what happens with their money. But the stuff that really makes that infrastructure provide services is the messy, difficult stuff. And these aren't even all of them. This was just try to give a sense of the different aspects that are out there. And if you could click one more time, I think there's a little animation here. So this is the system, which is often depicted as a beautiful circle, but I wanted to show that it's pretty messy and challenging, and you can't just swoop in and plug in a well. So the single-minded focus on direct outputs continues to ignore the other messy pieces that help to keep services going. And we know by the ongoing high failure rates and poor service levels that Catarina mentioned that we must do something different. Our research and interviews suggested that philanthropy needs to shift towards different kinds of investments, and they don't all have to be multi-year complex investments, but they can recognize the well-known gaps in understanding systems. So as you've heard before, we don't have a lot of information on what it costs. What are the finances? What are the life cycle costs? What are the contributions for water and sanitation services? This would be a great thing for an outside funder to fund, the research that's necessary for homes, schools, health centers, etc. How can we, advise finance ministers like Heloise was talking about if we don't know what the actual costs are? So there's other types of activities that can be supporting things like microfinance, village savings and loan groups. This is a more targeted kind of activity. Last year I learned more about a really interesting concept called borehole banking that Water for People and a couple of other NGOs are trying in Malawi and other places. There are things like performance-based funding. Learning more about this, but the Gates Foundation has an example of work on sanitation marketing with Thrive and IDE, and it's very interesting. Donors, external donors, philanthropic donors can fund systems change facilitation. What does that mean? Is that scary? Is it messy? But it involves collaboration, and it involves not doing it alone. And there are other donors and governments who are trying similar things, so you can work with them or join movements like the Agenda for Change. So there's a lot of other things that I could talk about here, but just in the interest of time, I'll stop, and maybe there's some time for questions.
Thanks so much, Susan. So I will leave this slide up. And Susan, I make sure to include the link to that report with the email that will go out to all people who registered, along with the webinar recording once we close out today. So I'd like to open up the floor for discussion. I'm aware that we've already gone over by a few minutes the hour that we had set aside for this discussion, but I see on my screen here that we actually haven't lost any attendees after hitting that hour. So if you have any questions, you can ask them using the chat feature or using the raise your hand feature. So when asking your question, if you could please introduce yourself and then maybe what country you're from or what your sector is within this topic, and specify maybe which speaker you're addressing if that's applicable. So I'll leave this current slide posted during this question answer period with the names of today's speakers and their contact information, which they've so graciously agreed to share, so if you want to follow up with them directly. And as well as the invitation for the last webinar of our webinar series, which is next week on the topic of youth. And to kick us off, I'm looking at a question that was asked in the chat box from Julius. And Julius says, I'm in Nigeria, I'm a student of water engineering and would like, oh, apologies, it looks like that was asking about the start time. And he also says, I'm originally from Kenya, and in my village of Kwoyo, school children are affected by the annual water shortage during the dry season. The problem can be solved by storing enough water and a seesaw pump to fill the water tanks. I'm a water engineer and willing to volunteer to do designs and any other works on this project. He's asking if there's anybody in the audience who might be receptive of a proposal for funding, or what types of funders he should outreach to, or other ways that maybe others in the audience or our panel speakers might have recommendations for that. So I can, I'm reluctant to unmute all the speakers, but if there's a specific speaker looking to address this question, I can unmute you if you chat in the box. Okay, Julius, it looks like in terms of specific answers to your questions, what we can do here from End Water Poverty standpoint, I can suggest that you look up grant opportunities with different foundations, either locally or based in other countries. If you want to get in touch with me directly, I can support you in that. My email address is listed on the slide here. So I'll open it back up for any other questions. Oh, and Susan Davis would like to add to that as well. washfunders.org is a good database of different funding sources for water and sanitation and hygiene initiatives in particular. So that might be a good place to start for looking at funding sources for your project. So thank you for your question. Okay, opening it up to any other questions, either using the chat feature or the raise your hand feature. I know it can be a little intimidating sometimes. Okay, in the meantime, our panelist Catarina, this is for Julius, would like to add to Susan's response and suggest that you look up the program Football for Water. It's in Kenya, and it specifically focuses on water access in schools. So both the washfunders.org database as well as the Football for Water program in Kenya would be good places for you to start looking for support for your project. So thank you for that. Okay, so I'll wait another minute or so, and that'll bring us to 10 minutes over the hour we had set aside for our discussion, to see if anybody else has questions for our speakers. Okay, I see one here from Kimberly Patrick says, what would be the potential benefit of a system that ranks the bottom 10 or 15% of the world's population by district rate or district reliance on unimproved sources, and directing big finance and finance efficiency strategies specifically there? So specifically focusing on the most marginalized people. So I'm understanding from your question, Kimberly, that you're looking at what those numbers would look like, maybe, or what would be the explicit benefit of that. So do you have a specific speaker in mind to address this question to? And she's asking about both water and open defecation. I'll open it up to all speakers if you're interested in addressing this question. You can feel free to chat me. So the question again is, what would be the potential benefit of a system that ranks the bottom 10 or 15% of the world's population with regards to open defecation, access to improved sanitation and water, and directing big finance and finance efficiency strategies specifically to those most marginalized and vulnerable? What would be the benefit of that system? So
Alix, I think one of the things that we do at Water for People in terms of that is, as we're crunching numbers and calculating what the costs are actually going to be, is we try to assess a percentage of people that are actually able to pay the tariff. And while we calculate the tariff, we look at affordability rates and looking at what percent of people's income is that, because there always will be the poorest of the poor and those who may not be able to pay the tariff that is set. And so how do you build into those costs? How do you build into the tariff some sort of a safety net? And so it's definitely something that we keep our eye on when we're calculating what the costs are and what when we're looking at revenues. And the revenue pieces sometimes have to factor in what might a bit of a safety net look like for the most marginalized and the poorest of the poor.
thank you for that. Kimberly, I hope that answers your question. I think that was great. Catarina also wanted to add to that the benefits in terms of access to improved, the improved access that focused funding would provide would be, reduce child mortality, reduce the burden for women for water collection, more kids getting to school, increased opportunities for getting out of poverty, just general health and well-being, all of that as well, which are benefits of improved access to water and sanitation as a whole. Okay, looking at other, I'm just looking through the list of questions that's been asked. There's a lot of great feedback from the audience showing appreciation for suggestions on how to address corruption, saying thank you for the presentations and thank you for the panelists. And I'm looking at if anyone has their hands raised, which currently nobody does. So while if anybody else has questions, feel free to ask them. And before we go, again, I'd like to invite you all to join us next week for our last webinar for Water Action Month webinar series, Tuesday, March 28th. We'll be looking kind of into the future and talking about the next generation of change makers and discussing why and how involving youth and children in WASH initiatives is important when we're talking about achieving the SDGs and SDG 6 in particular. So speakers will include representatives from the organizations you see on your screen here. Again, a great panel of speakers next week who will share experiences and lessons learned from their work. So there's a link on your screen here for registering for that webinar. It'll also be included in the email that you'll receive with the webinar recording, and I'll make sure to include the report from Susan, as well as a blog article that was based on that latest research. So if there are no burning last-minute questions, I will wrap up here. We look forward to seeing you next week if you can join us. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out either to myself or any of the speakers with the email addresses listed on your screen here. So thanks again so much, everyone. Wishing everybody a wonderful afternoon, evening, day, and a great rest of your week. It's been a pleasure being part of this with you today and an honor. Thank you.